Okay, the time now is 6 o'clock.
Okay, call meeting to order and have a roll call.
Director Danziger,
Here.
Director Hassler,
Here.
Director Jorgens is absent. Director Romer
Here.
and Director Romer is participating by Zoom. And President Jex.
Here. Would you like to join me in Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance to the
To the
flag
flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Like to invite public comment on items that are not on the agenda.
Okay, so public comment is now open for items that are not on the agenda. And so this is an opportunity for any members of the public to address the board concerning items that are not listed on the agenda. Speakers will be given an opportunity to speak on each agenda item at the time that that item is called. I've received one request so far to speak on items not on the agenda. Sandy Pearson. And then can we just make sure Sandy's microphone is unmuted?
Check. I'm unmuted. And I have a show and tell. I'd like to show Mike. Where's the camera?
The camera's right in front of you.
Well, not seeing it.
Here, let me,
Well, I can see it. I'm a little bit curious as to whether this is an item that's not on the agenda.
Oh,
Is it?
absolutely. I brought you a picture of a dead tree. And I'm sure, especially all the firemen in the room can identify that correctly as a dead tree. The reason it's important to me is it's also a granary tree for a colony of acorn woodpeckers. So that tree, a granary is any place you store your grain. And acorn woodpeckers obviously are interested in acorns. So that tree has got thousands of holes in it that have been drilled in it by woodpeckers over the 30 years they've been using it. And it holds their entire winter food supply. So here we have a feature on the landscape that has tremendous wildlife value because a colony of woodpeckers is 15 or 20 birds all living together in a hollow tree and guarding their granary tree from squirrels and other things that would like to steal their acorns. So you can cut this down and make the neighborhood more fire safe by not even 1 iota, but you will be wiping out a colony of animals that are really interesting and beautiful. And I think that's a trade-off worth considering. Thank you.
What percentage of dead trees harbor these granaries for the acorn woodpeckers?
Well, that's a good question. And another good question is how many dead trees are we going to be allowed to leave?
Well, it seems I love woodpeckers. I'd love to see the granaries preserved, but if it's less than 1%, it certainly seems to me that a request for modification would be appropriate and would be taken into consideration.
That could well be, and I think it would probably be looked on favorably, but beyond my personal problems, I would like the public to be aware that the fire district is cognizant of this problem and is willing to work with them and knows about it and cares about woodpeckers. I think that would do a lot for your image.
I am a birder, and on each of my trips to Africa, I have personally seen over 100 species. So woodpeckers have been among them.
Well, I envy you, and it would be great if we had some figure like, okay, we need one big snag per acre. And I'm just making that up, but there's some number that would make you happy and make me happy.
Appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
We do not have any hands raised or any other public comment.
Okay, then we'll move to the item 3.1, fire chief update and financial report operations.
Meeting directors, we'll begin with the finance report.
Good evening, directors. Tonight we have a financial update on the Tunnel East Bay Hills fuel break. The project budget for the fuel break is $6,380,563. As of June 30th, 2023, we had invoiced to CAL FIRE $475,000, $620. We have received payments for all the invoices we have submitted to CAL FIRE. So we have a zero outstanding receivable. We also in July through August have paid bills to vendors for work on the fuel break of $386,292. These bills will be invoiced to CAL FIRE on September 30th for the third quarter invoice. Invoices are presently being submitted to CAL FIRE quarterly until the new assistant project coordinator is hired. At that time, we'll have more resources and the district will change the submission of invoices to monthly. Next slide, please, Marcia. Another update on a treasury bill purchase on August 28th, 2023. We purchased a $4.5 million 30-day maturity treasury bill at a 5.28% yield. We completed the forward-looking cash flow, including the Tunnel East Bay Hills fuel break. And the projected cash outflow for September 2023 is estimated to be $2.8 million, and that includes about $1 million for the fuel break. Our LAIF balance on August 26th was $6.8 million. On August 27th, we transferred $6.4 million from LAIF. 1.9 was transferred to cash to help pay for payroll expenses and fuel break. And 4.5 million was used to purchase the 30-day treasury bill with the 5.28% yield. The remaining balance in LAIF after the transfer is $415,000. And the treasury bill matures on September 26th. The district now has 13.5 million invested in treasury bills. That concludes my report unless there are any questions.
Congratulations on collecting the money so quickly.
I would like to compliment Gloria and Mary taking the board's direction from the last meeting, moving very quickly to understand our outflows, particularly some of the lumpy elements associated with deferred capital purchases that the bill comes due whenever the equipment shows up. And of late, that's a little unpredictable, as well as a good understanding of the projected outflows associated with the fuel break, which was provided to the directors after the last meeting. And then moving to minimize the funds we have remaining in LAIF and taking advantage of the 30-day T-bills and their historically high interest rates to gain a better rate of return on funds that the district will expend prior to our large ad valorem inflow in December, finding a better place for that money to reside in the interim.
Great. Thank you. Okay.
And one other item just associated with this, Mary, if you could go back once, or Marcia, if you go back one slide, please. Just of note, a member of District Council's team provided us an update today that AB 338 just made it out of Senate Appropriations Committee, which would amend Labor Code 1720, making fuel mitigation work considered a public project, therefore potentially subject to prevailing wage and a number of other items that make our construction costs very high. That would specifically apply to residential chipping, rural road fuel breaks, fire breaks, and vegetation management. We'll continue to follow that, but should that occur, not only could some of the district's projects with regard to chipping significantly increase in cost through the prevailing wage provision, but our work on the fuel break could see a significant revision in the project budget. because we are not budgeting on an assumption of prevailing wage, because historically that didn't apply to this type of project. So we will continue to monitor that, but that does have a potential to significantly increase our costs for these projects and therefore decrease the production per dollar we can expect to see from this project and others.
Thank you.
And if we could go to the
Hey,
operations.
Chief, can you say that number again? AB?
338, sir.
Thanks.
And then
And Chief, I don't have slides for all.
correct. So a more complete financial update will be provided, but given the interest the directors had in the T-bill purchase, we thought an interim one would be appropriate since we're going to be gathering. And then for operations, there was quite a bit of interest at the end of August on the 22nd. We had a vehicle fire off the road near the intersection of Bear Creek Road and San Pablo Dam or Camino Pablo. Obviously, due to the number of folks that follow Pulse Point and other systems, that got a lot of attention. It was a vehicle fire into light flashy fuels, grass that can support rapid fire spread. Three things really combined to limit the impact of that fire, which was contained in and around the point of origin. First was that it was within the footprint of the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, where in conjunction with the Orinda School District, we've been doing periodic fuel reduction and prescribed fire to maintain the work that we carried out in the 2019 fuel break. So that limited the continuity of fuels, both the volume and the continuity of fuels there that were available to carry the fire. The second one was it happened during the evening with a maritime influence. So we had heavy wet air sitting in that particular area. For those of you who have passed through the Bear Creek Road and Camino Pablo intersection, there's an awful lot of cold air sits down there. It accumulates so that the relative humidity was high. Therefore, the light flashy fuels, they're defined as 1 hour fuels because they equalize with the ambient moisture in 1 hour. So they had equalized with the heavy wet air that settles in that area, which reduced their availability, which is obviously there's a temporal component too. There was also an absence of wind that supported or facilitated the absorption of that moisture. And the third was a large-scale multi-agency response, including response from MOFD, from Con Fire, and coming both ways, both up San Pablo Dam and down 24, as well as Cal Fire, since it occurred in state responsibility area. So it was it turned out to be not much of a fire, but it's a location that's of critical concern, particularly had that occurred in the fall on a north-northeast wind with dry air where the fuels were available. That's a particular spot where fire, if it made it over the fuel break mitigations and got onto the slopes leading up to El Toinal, it could have significant impacts because there are very few places in which we could make a stand upslope once it got across the road. So I did want to provide a brief update. We'll include that in the full operations update to the board at the regular board meeting.
Thank you.
And so we would like to open public comment for announcements. We do not have any public comment.
Okay, move on to item on the special agenda 4.1.
Good evening, directors. District Council will begin by introducing item 4.1 to introduce and waive the reading of ordinance number 23-08, an ordinance of the Moraga-Orinda Fire Protection District of Contra Costa County, adopting requirements for fuel breaks on certain parcels in both state responsibility and local responsibility areas within the fire district, and adopting updated findings of fact regarding fire hazards, and adopting findings of exemption under the California Environmental Quality Act.
Good evening, directors. As you are aware, the district received a threat of litigation related to our fuel break ordinance. That is actually the current version of that ordinance is roughly 6 months old, although it is basically reiteration of what had been in our fire code before that, and then was broken out. The allegation was essentially that we had not, at least in writing, analyzed exemptions from CEQA, and we had not made findings in writing related to CEQA exemption. So we looked into these concerns, and while we didn't agree, we did feel that it would be of value to go back and to write out the findings with respect to CEQA exemptions in the ordinance itself. In doing so, we brought on, we had Ruben Cruz, who you see from our firm. He kind of took the lead on putting together the changes to the ordinance. As I say, most of these changes, virtually all of the changes, relate to findings and to the exemptions themselves. There are a few small actual changes to the requirements of the ordinance that the chief will address. We also, in the process, brought on a law firm to specifically that specializes in CEQA to double check our work, as well as consultants to look at and double check our findings. So with that, I guess we're going to turn it over to Ruben to talk about the specifics of the findings.
Thank you, Ruben Cruz from the Rennie Public Law Group. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the board this evening. I'm going to address primarily the issue of CEQA. And under the law, certain types of governmental actions are considered exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, known as CEQA. Some of those exemptions are established by statute. Some are established by regulation, which are commonly known as categorical exemptions. And then third, there's also what is known as the common sense exemption, meaning that CEQA only applies to projects which have the potential for causing a significant effect on the environment. The amended fuel break ordinance before the board this evening contains findings that satisfy all three types of exemptions. The first one that I mentioned is a statutory exemption. The ordinance contains findings that it is statutorily exempt from CEQA as specific actions necessary to prevent or mitigate an emergency. And in those findings include the following, among others. Wildfires are inevitable in a fire-dependent ecosystem such as California. They often occur and spread unexpectedly and with surprising speed. They cause immense damage every year, putting lives and property in clear and imminent danger. In the absence of measures to manage outcomes, wildfire is likely to lead to structure loss and damage to the environment as a result of uncontrolled, fast-moving, and high-intensity fires. The ordinance reflects that the California legislature has specifically found that, quote, catastrophic wildfires pose an urgent threat to lives, property, and resources in California. Since October 30th of 2015, the state has been under a governor's state of emergency proclamation due to the increased risk of wildfires related to tree mortality. In addition, according to the California Office of Emergencies website, the state is currently under 24 separate state of emergency proclamations issued by the governor related to wildfires. The need for immediate action to prevent wildfire and its associated damage to life, health, property, and essential public services is well documented. In recent years, the governor has also repeatedly issued emergency proclamations related to fire, 5 in 2022, 7 in 2021, and 6 in 2020. These both evidence and acknowledge the need for immediate action to address wildfire hazards, particularly in fire-prone areas within the state. Uncontrolled wildfires are emergencies involving clear and imminent dangers, which demand immediate action to prevent or mitigate loss of or damage to life, health, property, and essential public services. This ordinance establishes actions necessary to reduce the probability and severity of such emergencies. The second type of exemptions that the ordinance addresses are categorical exemptions. The ordinance contains findings that it is exempt from CEQA under what are called the Class 7 and Class 8 categorical exemptions. These are actions taken by regulatory agencies, such as this board, as authorized by state law or local ordinance, to assure the maintenance, restoration, or enhancement of a natural resource or the environment where the regulatory process involves procedures for protection of the environment. As explained in the ordinance, uncontrolled wildfire causes significant environmental impacts in the fire district. These impacts include loss of vegetation and biodiversity, the potential for post-fire erosion, landslides, and debris flows, adverse air quality, increased greenhouse gases, climate change, and water quality impacts, and contaminated and hazardous material disposal challenges. These impacts in turn can damage and sometimes destroy local natural resources. This ordinance is intended to minimize structure fires and wildfire that lead to environmental and natural resources impacts. The establishment of fuel breaks to create a very fuel mosaic, mimicking the natural environment through zones of vegetation removal and ongoing maintenance, passively interrupts the path of a fire or slows its progress. This work also aids fire suppression by providing responders with anchor points from which to carry out fire control actions. Reducing the severity of wildfire through this ordinance will reduce the significant environmental impacts caused by uncontrolled wildfire and assure the maintenance, restoration, enhancement, and protection of the fire district's natural resources and environment. The ordinance also finds that there are no significant or potentially significant environmental impacts. Among other things, the ordinance requires that fuel breaks be constructed using the most ecologically and site-appropriate treatment options. The ordinance states that it shall not impact environmental resources of hazardous or critical concern were designated, precisely mapped, and officially adopted pursuant to law by federal, state, or local agencies. And such areas include, but are not limited to, sites listed as hazardous sites and also designated historical resources. The ordinance also is required to be interpreted and applied to avoid the taking of any special status species, significant erosion and sedimentation of surface waters, and the removal of healthy, mature scenic trees. If compliance with the ordinance could cause such adverse environmental consequences, property owners are directed to request a modification of the fuel break requirements from the district, and the fire code official shall issue modifications consistent with these requirements. And if a modification is not granted, a person can appeal that decision to this board for consideration. It's also noted that the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, in adopting fuel break requirements in the state fire safe regulations, has also relied on these categorical exemptions. And similar to this ordinance, the state fire safe regulations provide a procedure whereby persons impacted by the regulations can request an exception to address environmental conditions. No exception to these categorical exemptions as identified in the CEQA guidelines applies to this ordinance. And then finally, we have the common sense exemption. And the ordinance provides that it can be seen with certainty that there is no possibility that the ordinance may have a significant impact on the environment pursuant to the CEQA guidelines, specifically CEQA guideline 15601 subsection B3. The ordinance is proposed for the protection of the environment, including human health and property. The regulatory enactment would require affected properties to remove combustible materials as fuel breaks. These requirements would be beneficial to the environment by preventing the emergence and spread of wildfires, which can cause immense environmental harm. The ordinance also contains provisions requiring it to be interpreted and implemented in a manner that avoids environmental impacts and directs property owners to seek modification of the applicable requirements if compliance would cause any such impacts. Due to these requirements, there is no possibility that it will cause significant environmental effects. And thank you. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Directors, to add a number of comments and questions were raised by residents both to the city of Orinda at their meeting last night and captured in the letter received today, which was forwarded to the directors. Some of these concerns with regard to access to resources and so forth have not previously been raised. So in response to that, we proposed the following steps, which we will bring forward in advance of the next meeting. The first is working with the environmental consultants that we used on the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break and we're currently using on the Tunnel East Bay Hills Fuel Break, provide a list of best management practices in a recommendation based on fuel type or as a template that residents can use to guide their work to provide access to resources with regard to best practices, both in consideration of dusky-footed wood rat, Alameda whipsnake, and other special status species that are present. Propose adding to our fee schedule the opportunity for residents to utilize the district contractor, both biologist or geologist, in the same manner that we use for building plan review, that if there's a special expert required, the district can forward the plans to the expert for review and provide that service to the residents via our fee schedule. We also have can provide a list of ecological or environmental review companies that have done work in this area, are familiar with both the district's requirements and this particular ecosystem, so that residents have an idea of where to start should they seek to engage a qualified biologist or geologist to help guide their work. And we also, in response to the concerns raised both in the city's letter and from several of the residents' communication, we're producing a modification guide or template in a similar manner that we have done for applications for obstruction of a fire apparatus, access road, or traffic calming measures, laying out the steps. So I would think of it basically as an FAQ, along with some guidelines about how one would submit a modification. The modifications we've received to date fall into generally requests for extension of time, which can be explained on some of the larger parcels. That can be a multi-year extension, given that the creation of a fire-safe environment can be a significant undertaking. And so the fire marshal has worked with property owners, say, this is year 1 plan, this is year 2 plan, and up to year 3 plan, I believe the farthest we've seen. So there can be as simple as, I was out of town, I didn't get the notice, I need another couple of weeks. So the first category is generally extension of time. The second is extension or a modification of the work being done because of presence of either riparian, a special status species habitat, such as coarse scrub for Alameda whipsnake, or steep slopes with the potential for sedimentation of surface waters. And so the proposed guide or template would lay out the ways in which we have seen requests and how they were formatted and the sort of things that ought to be provided and the alternatives that should be included. Generally speaking, if an area is too steep to do work, one of the regular modifications is to move that work to an area that has a lower slope percentage where there's less issue for runoff and soil stabilization is not as great an issue. So we will bring those forward in advance of the next meeting so that both members of the public and the board have a better sense of both what the requirements are and how residents can meet the fire safety requirements while minimizing impact to the environment and not making this a voyage of discovery for each parcel, being able to capture the lessons learned and the best practices we've seen put into place on other parcels. I'd be the first to acknowledge that the Prevention Bureau and we have a bit of a blind spot here because this is an issue we're so close to and we spend so much time looking at that you see it enough times, the implementation starts to appear relatively simple. And we recognize and acknowledge that for a resident who is not aware of the background, hasn't done this before, that it can be overwhelming and perhaps even opaque. So we believe these measures will help address that, to include access to qualified biologists and geologists for those who choose to take advantage of that. We do continue to encourage folks who have had an environmental review completed to request modification and cite the BMPs and list in the environmental review. Those are not maintained in a centralized place. The district does not have awareness or visibility of which parcels have completed. And as you saw in the communication I shared with the owner of the Bodfish property, where environmental review had been completed, BMPs were in place for dead trees, live trees, brush, and decadent ground material or duff and litter, with consideration for whipsnake habitat and dusky-footed wood rat habitat, both of which were identified on the parcel. In that case, the environmental review lays out the roadmap of what can be done. That's not something the district has access to or was aware of until it was provided. And in a case such as that, the modification is as simple as saying, these are the BMPs identified in our environmental review, and I request a modification that I will carry out work in the fuel break area in accordance with those BMPs. So we'll put together some products that we believe will help make this process less opaque, increase awareness of the process. To date, we have 210 modifications have been received. The only ones I'm aware of that have not been approved are ones that ask for a multi-year extension of time without a progression of work that would be done in the interim. All other modifications have been approved, and we're simply, not only have we not denied a modification that is associated with documented environmental restrictions, I don't believe we are able to do that. We don't have the authority to override Fish and Wildlife or the water quality agencies or any of the other folks that regulatory agencies in the environmental space, that their laws and regulations preclude ours. That said, we do believe fire safety is consistent with fuel modification in an environmentally sensitive way, and habitat can be conserved, as we have shown through our successful project in the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, and continue to show through the Tunnel East Bay Hills Fuel Break, where we're carrying out work under environmental monitoring in a way that is consistent with core scrub and the presence of special status species habitat. So we'll put together some products that we believe will help make that process better understood and increase awareness of what the requirements are under the fuel break and how residents can comply with those in environmentally sensitive or minimizing the disruption of the natural space. I would note, as we've said before, I think it's worth saying again, as we talked about last month, if you look at the picture just outside this room on your way out of Orinda, what we have now is not this environment's natural state. This is not an ecosystem that's in equilibrium. And the presence, the exclusion of fire for the last 110 years and the presence of all the accumulated vegetation that has taken advantage of that disrupted fire return interval is not natural. It's not in equilibrium, and it sets conditions for high intensity, fast moving fire that will be destructive both to our residents and to the environment.
If I could interrupt real quickly, Chief, I mean, I had a number of questions, and I think you've answered most of them, but I would like to focus upon the template that you're talking about. And as I understand it, and as a matter of background, I think that I have reached out to get some detail on what transpired at the very participatory city council meeting last night. And I have reached out to two of the city council members, including the mayor, to listen to their concerns. And I think one of the things that they included in a letter, and for the record, I have read all of the letters and reread all the letters, including the ones that just came in within the last hour. And as I understand it, one of the suggestions that they made was for a template. However, as I understand it, we have already had 204, did you say, requests for modification, and citizens have already figured out how to request for modifications without having a template, correct?
Yes, sir. 210.
210 requests. And of those, can you give us some kind of a percentage breakdown as to how many have been granted in whole or in part?
I don't have those numbers because they continue to evolve, but we'll certainly provide more detail both of received, reviewed, approved, modified, denied, and then categorize them. So I should note that some of those that are included in the total are not, strictly speaking, requests for modification. The form has been used in ways for things other than that. So that the number of actual modifications requests is lower than 210, but we'll have a full breakdown of that at the regular.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just trying to get a general idea that, one of the other criticisms made is that it's complex legislation. It's a complex ordinance. As an attorney who's been practicing for almost 40 years, I have to concede that whether we're talking about the Constitution, regulations, statutes, laws, or ordinances, most are complex. That's why we have trials and attorneys and judges and courtrooms. And while we strive for clarity, we can't always get perfect clarity. And I have to reach out to Ruben and the Rennie Law Firm to say that as I've read and reread this ordinance, I actually think that the more I read it, the more remarkably clear it is. However, it's not going to be clear to all persons at all times. And in order to have a legislation, an ordinance that deals with these issues, it seems to me that it's almost impossible to create something that is applicable to 10,000 or so parcels and 20,000 plus individuals and the circumstances. So it's absolutely essential that the citizens work with the enforcement mechanism, and that really is primarily through the modification process. And you sent a link with that modification to everyone who submitted a letter protesting this ordinance. Isn't that correct, Chief?
Yes, sir. We're attempting to ensure that the process is understood, and so that folks who have concerns are aware of the process for submitting their concerns and requesting modification.
And of the people that you sent those letters to, how many of them actually have initiated requests for modifications through the form?
We haven't received any yet, sir.
None. Okay. And have they acknowledged receiving the response from you?
Yes, sir.
They have. Okay. So it seems to me that it's not a question. So I think it's a good idea to provide a template. And what you have in mind for the template is actually filling out examples of how to fill out this one-page form. Is that right?
What we have in mind, sir, more has to do with if your request is for an extension of time. Here's an example of what extensions of time have looked like in the past. I.e., we received one just recently that asked for an extent without any details, request an extension through October 2024. That would be the sort of thing that is light on details. What we would like to see is if the project is complex enough that it does in fact require over a year to complete, what are the steps you're going to take on say a quarterly basis to get there? And what are the elements that make it too onerous to comply in the short term? We're not opposed to approving it, but we would like to know what the plan is, assuming that the request for an extension, that time was, they back planned from a series of steps. As a general statement, if a resident is engaging and has a plan, we are generally in great support because as residents get started, we understand this is a process. We understand it is different than things have been before. We also, however, are 6 years in to this effort and we'd like to see progress. But when residents are carrying out work, we're grateful for that, eager to work with them to figure out the most efficient and the least disruptive way that we can both arrive at our shared goal of reducing the risk of destructive wildfire.
Okay. I don't have any further questions at this time. I do have further comments, but there may be more appropriate after we've heard from our participants who want to address this issue.
If I could have one saved round, sir, just one thing to point out, as Ruben mentioned, that the requirements for the fuel breaks are largely unchanged, going back to the fire code of 2019 and then the ordinance this year. There is one significant change that appears on page 6 under item C, which was on recommendation of council with regard to CEQA. And that is previously there was a prohibition on non-irrigated brush within 100 feet of a structure within a fuel break. And this modification, the change to the proposed change allows the maintenance of clusters of non-irrigated brush with separation dependent on the slope. This is drawn from recommendations included CAL FIRE in their LE 100 and allows the maintenance of brush for whatever reason, soil stabilization, habitat, et cetera, with clusters allowed on flat or mild slopes of less than 20%, that 2 times the height of the shrub be maintained a space between them, on mild or moderate slopes of 20 to 40%, 4 times the height of the shrub between clusters, and on moderate steep slopes greater than 40%, 6 times the height of the shrub. Obviously, there's a compromise element to that given that we are concerned about a wind-driven fire, and in wind-driven fires such as the North Bay fires of 2017, there were areas in an oak savanna such as this with 20 to 25 foot flame lengths, but 3 foot scorch heights. So all that 25 feet of flame was being laid flat by the high winds and was only rising 3 feet off the ground. And the other 22 feet of residual flame was sheeting out ahead. That said, as you disrupt the continuity of fuels, that can make it more challenging for fire to pick its way through the labyrinth. So we believe that provides some relief with regard to the concerns about denuding slopes and they're largely brush covered. It is a compromise, but one that is consistent with the guidance provided by CAL FIRE on that topic. So that change is less restrictive than the previous language. I also, in response to a request from Director Jorgens following some of his discussions, he pointed out that while we've been talking about this issue a lot, going back to 2018, and we have regularly reviewed the fire science, recent research from NIST and IBHS and other research and experimentation organizations, folks who were not aware of the requirement because we had not been actively enforcing in their area. And I think that is that's once again a blind spot for those of us who are very close to it. Our assumption is at this point was that everyone had heard about these and was aware. And based on the feedback we've been getting, that clearly was not, that hypothesis did not stand at first contact. So on September 19th at 7 o'clock in the Founders Room at the Community Center, which is the night before the regular board meeting, Dennis Rain, Jeff Isaacs, and I will be holding a public meeting where we will present the fire science and the modeling that went into the development of our modifications to the local amendments to the fire code, as well as the proposed ordinance for defensible space, the proposed ordinance for updating our fuel break requirements, as well as our existing defensible space ordinance. So that'll be a presentation followed by an opportunity for question and answers to explain the research, the fire science that's come out of that research, the modeling that we've used to validate the application of those findings to our environment in a Mediterranean county here, and how that influenced the recommendations that are included in the local amendments to the fire code, as well as our defensible space and fuel break ordinance.
That's this coming December.
September.
Oh, September.
Yes, sir. September 19th at 7 in the community room. A announcement has been,
Not yet.
will be posted shortly.
Okay.
Thanks, sir. Concludes my
Very
report.
good. Any other comments or questions?
So Chief, well, first of all, I just want to say that the priority of the board and the district is to make our community as safe as possible. I'm council, all the citizens, everyone wants us to be safe. And, some people have called our district aggressive or abusive and, this and that. I understand that, but, we all want to make us as safe as we can. And so, there's a fine line we have to walk between making our district as safe as we can and the environmental impact of it. So with that said, I just have a few questions for some modification. So Ms. Pearson here showed us a picture right there of a snag. Maybe not. There's evidence of woodpeckers living in that particular tree. I don't know. Could that possibly qualify for a modification? So just using that example, I have a tree on my property. I see woodpeckers. Could that qualify?
Yes, sir. And that I would take at the macro scale on the Tunnel East Bay Hills fuel break where we conducted the recent tour. There was in the middle of this big, beautiful shaded fuel break, there was several dead trees, very prominently featured, which the monitoring biologist tagged as that's habitat for a variety of species, and therefore those particular trees that had a higher density of species of interest with habitat concerns and so forth. Those trees were specifically identified to remain in place, even though they diminish the value of the fuel break. That said, it's not all of them. It is also a true statement that the district is not qualified to make that call, nor are most residents. And we've encountered this problem in the past where a resident will announce that a particular area was, in one case, was mountain lion habitat. And we saw what happened with the town of Woodside with an attempt to make an unqualified determination of special status species habitat with regard to housing. So in a case like that, where a resident has a concern that that tree has particular biological or environmental importance, that's where the engagement of a qualified biologist who could make the determination that that tree was in fact critical habitat. And if there were several trees, what was the density which would have to remain in order to sustain the habitat? Because otherwise, we get into a very, very subjective space where one person's habitat is another person's fire code violation, in this case, ordinance violation. Right. And the district receives calls on both of those fronts. We regularly receive calls saying, why haven't you enforced to require these things to be removed in these places? Often having to do with dead trees that are not covered by our ordinances and fire code because they are not within 100 feet of a structure or 100 feet of a property line. There is no prohibition on dead trees in those spaces. It is only when the dead tree falls within 100 feet of a property line or 100 feet of a structure, a habitable structure, that these things kick in. And that's where in the engagement of a qualified biologist, I think is critical to maintain a degree of certainty about what is and under what, who made the determination, which neither the district nor most residents are qualified to make that call.
Question on that, when you're talking about a biologist, that particular engagement would be up to the property owner to engage and pay for it.
Yes, sir. And I think the best example I can think of is if you're going to be building a house or doing a remodel, the person who is doing the work is responsible for engaging the architect and the engineers. And the building code official's role is to review them. This is a similar place, except in this case, we're not necessarily reviewing because we're not qualified to. We're accepting it and then recording it as a modification. And that's just to make an additional point. The importance of the modification process is that it documents the engagement, it documents the outcome. That provides certainty for the resident, that provides certainty for the fire district. And most importantly, when we receive a complaint about that, in the case of a large prominent dead tree, I don't disagree that may be a granary and critically important. And I don't disagree that a biologist might say that tree needs to remain, which we would be happy to approve. To the casual observer, there would be a dead tree that would appear to represent a fire risk, those are the concerns we receive. And at which point it's tremendously helpful to have documented the process through modifications to avoid the appearance either of the favoritism or selective enforcement of the code. And then it creates a record to which all parties can refer to in the future. And in places where we have approved modifications, I have regularly cited that modification in response to complaints from other residents that the parcel is non-compliant with our codes or ordinances, saying, I understand that it appears so, but here's how a modification was requested, reviewed, approved, and documented, so that we essentially create an alternate ordinance that is site-specific through that process.
I think you said you had some other.
Yeah, I do.
questions.
So I think this came up at the council meeting last night, and I just want you to clarify it. All of our district, I'll state it, what I think it is. I believe that all our district is referred to as a community at risk.
Yes, sir, as designated by the state in 2003,
Right,
in the
okay.
case of Moraga-Orinda, in 2008, in the case of Canyon.
Yep.
I should clarify that, sir, though. All of our district that are within the municipal boundaries of Moraga-Orinda, and then the census named place of Canyon are designated as communities at risk. Bollinger, the portions of Bollinger that are outside the city of Moraga, or the town of Moraga town limits, are not classified as such. And the unincorporated county spaces that make up the watershed and parklands to our north, west, and south are not considered communities at risk. So the ordinance was tailored to apply to the areas in the community that are either within or within the fire district, that are either within a community at risk, Moraga-Orinda Canyon, or immediately adjacent, as in they share a property line with a community at risk, Moraga-Orinda Canyon, Kensington, Berkeley, Oakland, or have a habitable structure, which was, we recommend an amendment that you saw in the memo that would include the portions of Bollinger. That came in response from concerns from residents there that their area was not being addressed by the proposed ordinance. This would exclude the primarily parklands and watershed, but some privately owned parcels that are not within Moraga-Orinda Canyon and do not share a border with either of those communities or Berkeley, Oakland, and Kensington.
There were some concerns regarding downtown Orinda. I know Mayor Miller is here, and she brought it up regarding street trees
Yes, sir.
in the downtown area specifically. Does this ordinance apply to street trees and
Well,
as anywhere else? or-
I should
mean-
say, from a practical standpoint, no, sir. From a letter of the law, yes, but with the caveat that we have a proposed amendment in response to one of the city's concerns, which our practice has always been trees less than 15 feet do not require 6 feet of limbing. They require 1/3 of the height of the tree to allow a small tree to grow. But obviously, that would apply with newly planted trees, and we have a proposed amendment tonight that would enshrine that language in the ordinance. Most street trees obviously are limbed up so that pedestrians can walk underneath them, and they don't have low-hanging branches so people won't climb them. So a street tree that is limbed up 6 feet is compliant even with a strict interpretation of the ordinance. It is also very reasonable to say a modification would be a tree surrounded by concrete and asphalt within this sort of area, or green irrigated grass or other maintained landscaping of that sort with low accumulations of combustible material that have neither vertical nor horizontal continuity. That would be a very easy get to yes, because there is simply no practical wildfire risk reduction element that would be achieved by minimizing street trees planted either in planters or in openings in a concrete and asphalt base.
Okay. There's been, it's come up several times about South Marin Fire District and the guide that they provide. And I looked at that online, and I mean, it looked pretty thorough to me. Is that something that you're looking at as perhaps a model for what you're proposing?
We certainly could. That was the work of a very talented and well-paid consultant. We could certainly engage someone who has some experience and skill. That's not something district staff has. I
Right.
generally
Yeah.
draw with a crayon and not very well. So we were thinking more on a technical side as far as a technical template, but if there's interest from the board in creating a flyer that illustrates what right and wrong looks like with more sophistication than what we've done on our website, we certainly could do that.
Okay. You can go ahead.
Okay, Mike, did you have some other questions?
In the interest of time, I'm going to try to reserve any comments or questions until after I've heard from members of the public. I'm fine. No, am I muted? I was muted for a while. We have a full-on thunderstorm and a downpour where I'm calling in from, and I needed to mute to keep that noise down. Sorry.
Okay.
I have one more question.
Sure.
One more that right for right now. So in the prior code, we went from 30 feet to 100 feet. And that seems to be an issue for people who have large properties, especially in North Orinda. Could you just address that a little bit about that change from 30? And I want to make clear that it wasn't in this ordinance, that was already prior, right?
Yes, sir.
But-
It really had to do with reducing the complexity and uncertainty surrounding which requirements applied where. That said, one of the requests for modification we have discussed but not seen yet and would approve if we saw it is when there are two adjoining properties and there is not a house associated with either one of those, then a reasonable modification would be 50 feet on each side of the line to achieve the 100 feet. 100 feet with the smaller parcels had, in addition to the complexity, also had to do with the situation where you have larger parcels, but the structures are clustered right next to the property line, so that the structure is unable to achieve 100 feet of defensible space on their own property. And that defensible space essentially has to carry over onto the adjoining property. But when we speak about complexity and understanding, carving out variable width fuel breaks based on the presence or absence of a structure on the opposite side of the property line can become very challenging both to explain, to enact, and to enforce very quickly.
Okay, well, and would like to invite the public if they have any comments that they'd like to make.
We have received 10 written correspondence. 9 of the correspondence came in before or by 3 p.m. today and have been posted on our website. The written correspondence was from Charles Porges, Tyler Rust, Michael Bowen, the California Native Plant Society, Stephen Silla, Julia Hunting, Barbara Littner, Greenfire Law, previous correspondence, and the City of Orinda. Then after 3 p.m., we received correspondence from Ann Walgenbach, which was also forwarded to the directors and that will be posted on the website tomorrow. Her email stated that she would like to support the maintaining of the 100 fuel break perimeter requirement. She realized that this is costly, time-consuming, possibly unnatural, or not as visibly appealing and involves hard work. But I think that not making bigger efforts like this at fire prevention are way worse on every measure. And I think that folks from Santa Rosa, Paradise, and other areas who have experienced the ravages of huge fires might agree. We are in the throes of unusual times. She attached podcasts about the Canadian fires of the summer. She would also like to note that a neighbor in Moraga is unable to get homeowners insurance, and a State Farm agent has advised that they are no longer covering policies here when they had been up until recently. And then she attached photos.
I read her letter and I read them all, and I thank you, Anne. I appreciated the letter.
And so we do have one hand raised on Zoom, and we have 2 present here to speak. I'm going to go ahead and the persons present, I'll have go first.
Okay.
Mayor Miller.
Good evening, honorable members of the board, and President Jax, thank you for your service. And my name is Inga Miller. I'm mayor of the city of Orinda, and we provided a letter today with our comments, listing our concerns with the proposed ordinance, which can be summed up as assuring the ordinance leads to the intended purpose and not to unintended consequences. We have urged a slowing down of this process in order to have a community process and opportunity for our concerns to be addressed. We understand, I hear this evening that it's announced here that there will be a meeting on September 19th at 7 p.m. Respectfully, that is concurrent with our city council meeting. The city has offered to co-host meetings with the district and the city of Moraga to initiate a process that assures our community has notice of this ordinance and questions are answered. And we assure that this creates a path toward compliance by our community without unintended consequences. I understand from discussion with or chatting with Director Jorgens today that you have a very skilled soils person, geologist, and it sounded like a wonderful thing to have these people present answering questions from the public. I believe there was raised a question about my question about the street trees, which I understand is an issue regarding apparatus, and that under the current regulations, there is an indication that our trees and that the trees would have to be removed, the street trees, if a building is built there, unless there is a different type or an alternative construction used to handle apparatus. And I would respectfully ask that you ask staff to provide those code sections to our staff, because we would like to be able to research that to assure that we can provide, understand those laws, and then to see if we want to include things in our codes to require that higher standard to provide for the existence of those street trees. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm just pulling up my timer so I can start my timer. So the next speaker, Barbara Litnier. And I just want to confirm, you had said agenda item number 2, but I believe this is the item.
I just submitted my written comments at 2:58 today and didn't get a confirmation. So I just wanted to make sure that those were received. And I don't really have anything to add to that.
Yes, your comments were received and they're on the website. Yes.
And we got them, Barbara,
Thank
we got them as well.
Thank you.
So I'm now pulling up the virtual participants. Mark Evans.
Hey, good evening. This is Mark Evans. I live in North Orinda. I have a property that's over an acre. We not only have all 100 foot of the perimeter cleared, we have the entire property cleared. Why? To comply with MOFD. Why? Because we care about our neighbors. And these neighbors who say that, oh, I don't want to do this, they don't really understand where we're at. I believe many of them have lived here for many, many years. I understand they want their privacy, but if we're going to work as a community, we need to follow the lead of our fire district experts, follow the fire science, and figure out how to reduce the fuel in our neighborhoods. So I strongly support the recommendation of the fire district to continue the 100 feet perimeter and continue to try to make our community safer. Thank you.
Thank you. The others?
So we do not have any more comments. We've not received any other written public comment.
Okay. We'll move on then to. Before we do proceed with the motion, do we want to amendment 1 and amendment 2? Did we want to incorporate those before we, as well as I think, Council, you have a.
Yes,
one as
thank
well.
you. Thank you. So what staff would like to do is propose 3 amendments. And if you agree with these amendments, then the next action would be that you would move to amend the ordinance to include these. You'd vote on that, and then you'd vote on the ordinance as a whole. So the three amendments are the following. Two of them are on this memorandum that has been distributed, and I think everybody in the audience has it. One, staff proposes to add the following paragraph to the discussion under topographical conditions of the findings of fact, section 2K, Roman 3B1. The district's topography is variable and characterized by hill slopes, valleys, ridges, ravines, canyons, and plateaus. These topographic features can accentuate the climatic drivers to increase fire risk described above, including topographic, microclimate, and firestorm-induced extreme velocity winds, which can move a wildfire across the landscape at tremendous speeds, including the ability to jump large perceived barriers such as Highway 24, as was breached in the 1991 Oakland Hills fire. So that's amendment number one. Amendment number two would amend section 4B, which is identified as fuel break affected parcels, by adding subsections 3 and 4. Subsection 3 would read, would include, and this has to do with the coverage of the ordinance, as the chief was referring to earlier. All parcels within the district located in the unincorporated area of Contra Costa County, which have at least one habitable structure, those would be included. And then the other is all parcels within the district that are immediately adjoining to a parcel or parcels described in subparagraph 3 above. So those two subsections would be added. And then finally, as the chief discussed, with respect to trees. So section 4A1F would be amended to read as follows. Maintain trees to remove ladder fuels so that twigs or branches are 1, greater than 6 feet above the ground for trees 15 feet or taller, and 2, at least 1/3 of the height of the tree above the ground for trees less than 15 feet tall. So those are the three amendments that we would propose.
Okay. I guess a motion.
A quick question.
Yes.
Chief, we just heard Mayor Miller say that the date that you were talking about having the public forum was the same night as their council meeting.
Yes, sir.
So-
We'd be happy to move it. The concern was, or the attempt was, to be responsive to questions residents might have about the fire science in advance of our board meeting the following night. We could certainly push it out after the board meeting, but our concern was that several questions have been raised, both in the threat of litigation and from resident requests for what is the underlying science? How do we know this is the work that is appropriate for our environment and these fuel types, this combination of topography, weather, and fuels? And so we've talked about this a lot in the past. You could probably piece it together from hours of watching me talk on YouTube, but the idea was to have a targeted meeting where folks who are not previously engaged in this process could come have their questions answered. As I said, we could push it out. We could hold it earlier in the day, but there are a finite number of weekday evenings at a time that facilitates participation by those who work.
Where was it going to be?
In the founder's room next door. As I said, I don't think it's a space issue. It has more to do with if members of the city council wanted to attend to have their questions answered, or residents who were torn between the two spaces. Yeah. As I said, if at the councils, we can hold multiple of these. We can talk about this at length, and we could hold another one on a different night, or we could move this one. I certainly defer to the board with regard to the best way to approach that problem.
Yeah, I would just add, that there is tremendous urgency to get this back in place. As the board is aware, we have suspended enforcement of the fuel break ordinance pending this adoption. And so, the challenge is we've already lost, I don't know, 6 weeks of fire season in getting this in place. And so there's a real urgency to get this back in place.
entertain a motion.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was gonna just, we need to make sure the public doesn't have any questions.
Well, the public will come
Can
after
public-
we make the nation.
Oh.
So we've taken public comment, and then once the motion is made, we will open public comment again
Yeah.
on that motion.
Maybe my question is, my question is, like, when I read through these are, well, possibly with the exception of for the second one, right? Like the first item, I don't know that's more of just a general statement, right? Just if I was generalizing what we have here. it's a
Amendment
general
number one?
statement. Amendment number one.
Yes, sir.
just a
It's,
general statement.
it's adding additional weight to the CEQA exemption.
Yes, okay. And amendment number two is to add certain parcels to coverage.
Yes, sir. If I could, and just to clarify, remembering that the previous fuel break requirement that was in the fire code was moved out of the fire code in response to East Bay Park's concerns into ordinance 23-04 earlier this year. The changes that are proposed, both in the amendment and the ordinance, in addition to the spelling out what we believe are the pre-existing exemptions to CEQA, those are essentially that process is being defined, but there's no practical change with regard to residents. The practical changes from this new proposed ordinance to the existing ordinance are excluding parcels that are not in or adjacent to a community at risk or a habitable structure. So there are parcels that were previously subject to the fuel break ordinance that will no longer be subject. So it is less onerous in that space. And adding the allowance of concentrations of separated concentrations of brush in a space where they were previously prohibited. And then adding the clarification about the trees less than 15 feet, which had always been our practice, but it spells it out more explicitly. So in the places where there are practical changes from our existing ordinance to the proposed ordinance, they are less restrictive in nature. And that the discussion, obviously, there's lots of things we can do and are committed to increasing awareness of it. But the ordinance on its merits is less restrictive than what we have been doing until we suspended enforcement in early August.
Okay, I just think that's helpful. to
Yes, sir.
Set context. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah, that, in regards to any, guide we might put out, just not specifically on the ordinance right now, but any guide. Two issues that I see continuously, and I personally see them too. One has to do with, riparian areas, where people, I think not many, but I think some property owners aren't aware of the regulation in riparian areas, where one of the letters we got talked about going down and cleaning out the creek area where I know it's not required. And so I just want to make sure that whatever we put out, that it's really clear, and that if people have questions, what is a riparian area and what are the regulations, they know where to go. right?
Yes, sir.
Really, clear. And the other one has to do with landscapers in our whole district. And I've experienced this firsthand myself, where for many landscapers who are going in and cutting seasonal grasses or trimming trees, it's a lot easier to just go in there and cut everything down. And I think Ms. Leitner's who here talked about, most some of the professionals going in and cutting down to the ground, not leaving the 3 inches, or taking all the trees. I mean, it's a lot easier, for someone. And so I would like to somehow, and maybe we can talk about it further at a meeting, maybe through one of our committees that Director Jorgens and Director Romer is on, but maybe an educational component for landscapers, some kind of something we can give landscapers, something we can bring to the nurseries in the area that explains, what our requirements are and what they don't have to do. Maybe I'm not, saying it correctly, but I just see sometimes that they go in and try to denude an area because it's a lot easier. And honestly, sometimes there is language barriers to explain what needs to be done. And so maybe maybe even producing some kind of document in Spanish would help as well.
Yes, sir. You may recall, we've long distributed the same guide that the FAC-A program is built upon, with the front in English and the back in Spanish, with thanks to Mona in the office who did the translation, explaining what the minimum requirements are, understanding that one, that's the minimum, and two, there are many ways that are suited to the homeowner's taste, who they're using, the time and resources allotted to it. There are many ways that those minimums can be achieved, and the residents who choose to go beyond those, and the residents who choose to meet those requirements in a very environmentally sensitive way, and there's others who choose to brute force it with machinery. But the district obviously doesn't have a role in regulating the manner in which people carry out the work.
Yeah, I would just like to see, and we can talk about it further, but putting out something perhaps for our local landscapers, and somehow if they have an organization or some way to get them this information. I don't know if there is.
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, it's a very disorder. We've tried quite a bit specifically having to do with the mulch within 2 feet, because that's so poorly understood, and that constitutes the bulk of the violations we've had in our fire code or in our Firewise neighborhoods during the recent inspection season. Unfortunately, it's very loose, and there are not professional associations and so forth. It's also a highly transitory population. So what we've reverted to is attempting to educate the homeowners and the residents, and relying on them to relay their desire about how they intend to achieve these fire safe minimums to the folks they employ, if not themselves.
Okay.
Okay.
So could we just get an explanation of the process right now? So, what we're going to do tonight, what happens on the 20th?
Yes, sir. So this is a first reading. So tonight, the process would be to consider and vote upon the proposed amendments, and then provide direction to staff about any other changes or other associated work products that the board would like to see. Staff will produce the work products we've discussed as a way of increasing transparency and awareness. Obviously, those with regard to some of the BMPs will be slightly in flux pending adoption of the final ordinance, since the requirements are currently the old ordinance would be the requirements. Then at the regular board meeting would be the second reading and adoption, and that would be an opportunity for the board to consider adopting, consider making changes. I defer to council about what constitutes a major change, but there is a threshold beyond which changes would necessitate another second reading, since the ordinance would be fundamentally changed, and that's to encourage or to allow the public an opportunity to comment on the final product.
I thought this evening it was a second reading.
No, sir. First
reading.
We discussed this we discussed the proposed or the pending litigation in closed session last month,
Okay.
which then from that, with board's direction, worked with council and the
And
experts.
then we have the amendments tonight.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
That's right.
Go ahead, yeah.
So we wanted to get the amendments before you so that there wasn't, again, minimal changes, hopefully, for the second reading.
Yeah, and based on what Mr. Cruz presented to us and what you're telling us, I'm ready to support this.
Okay.
So I make a motion that we accept the proposed amendments to ordinance 2003-08, 1, 2, and 3.
And to introduce and waive the.
Oh, sorry, and what?
No, they need to first vote to amend, and then we'll do the
Approve the
corrections.
amendments, right?
The amendments,
Yes,
that's correct.
Okay.
And clarifying that Amendment 3 was the one that proposed by council that included 1/3 of trees less than 15 feet. high.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. I would like to invite public on
And do we have a second?
comment.
I will second. This is Director Romer.
So we can invite public comment on this motion. We've not received any written public comment, and I'm just checking the participants. We do not have any hands raised. We do not have any members in person wishing to speak on this motion.
Okay, then any further comment by the board?
So on the motion.
On the motion to amend, Director Danziger,
Aye.
Director Hassler,
Aye.
Director Jorgens is absent, Director Romer,
Aye.
President Jex.
Aye. Motion passes. Okay, move on to.
No, so the next would be a motion to adopt, or sorry, to waive first reading, not adopt.
So we want
It's 4.1. Yeah,
to, okay, 4.1.
apologize.
So we need a motion to waive the first reading of ordinance 28.
This is Director Romer. I will make a motion under special agenda 4.1 to introduce and waive the reading of ordinance number 23-08, an ordinance of the Moraga-Orinda Fire Protection District of Contra Costa, California, adopting requirements for fuel breaks on certain lands within both the state responsibility and local responsibility areas within the district, including the adoptions and the amendments just adopted, as stated in the entirety of this special agenda item. So moved.
I'll second that.
It's been moved and seconded.
And so we will open up the public comment on that
Public comment.
motion. And we do not have any members of the public wishing to speak. We have one hand raised. Mark Evans.
I just want to compliment the directors for supporting, I guess, the thing that I was going to say earlier, but I didn't click it right, was I want to encourage you to use your common sense. And it appears that you have, that this is, I believe, a relatively small number of large parcels that are affecting our prevention of wildfire throughout our community, Moraga and Orinda. And the outside counsel used that term common sense. So I think let's encourage each other to use common sense to prevent wildfire safety. I've never heard of the woodpecker being a species that's under attack. We're surrounded by forests to the north, to the west, to the east. Clearing up some property to help our community stay safe is not going to impact the impact of the wildlife in our neighborhood. So thank you for your support of making our community safer.
Thank you.
And we do not have any more hands raised or
Okay.
any other public comment. Director Danziger,
Aye.
Director Hassler,
Aye.
Director Romer,
Aye.
President Jex.
Aye. Okay, move on to agenda item 4.2.
Authorize fire chief to enter into agreements for wildland fuel management, tree removal, and hazard abatement services, and authorize the fire chief to enter into agreement for environmental compliance service for wildland fuels management.
Good evening, directors. The district is currently carrying out state-funded fuel mitigation work as part of the Tunnel East Bay Hills Fuel Break. This project requires the use of specialized fuel mitigation contractors for a variety of tasks. In August 2023, staff posted 2 fuel reduction RFPs. One RFP was for wildland fuel management, tree removal, and hazard abatement services. The second RFP was for environmental compliance services for wildland fuels management. These RFPs identified the type and scope of work and asked the contractors to submit pricing for the identified types of work. RFP information was forwarded to contractors with whom the district has done business and posted on the district website in accordance with the purchasing ordinance. The district received 16 proposals for fuel reduction work. The proposals are summarized in attachment A. Staff recommends contracting with the following contractors: Atlas Sonoma Tree Surgery, Bay Area Tree Specialist, East Bay Tree Services Incorporated, Expert Tree Service, Essential Vegetation Management Services, Rapid Response LLC, Twin Cities Tree Service, and Wildland Corporation. The district also received 2 proposals for biological monitoring. Staff recommends selecting Sequoia Environmental. It's of note that these are not to exceed contracts, so that we have open contracts with the money that has been allocated either through has been identified through the budget process, and in this particular case, the bulk of which is coming from state grants, so that we have contractors upon whom we can call to carry out both the fuel break or other mitigation services. It's of note that while the contracts are not to exceed $2 million, this does not mean we will spend $2 million with each contractor. These are the budget process guides how much money we can spend. But what we found on the last contract, on the last RFP, was that one contractor in particular was the only provider of a very specialized and very expensive resource in the form of hand crews. And we rapidly ran up against the headspace of how much contracting room we had, meaning that we've now slowed work until we can get a new RFP. We would like to avoid that by setting the ceiling high. Obviously, no money will be spent that was not budgeted by the board. So in this case, it's a $6 million fuel break. Adding up all of these folks, that means each one is not going to receive $2 million worth of contracted services, but we don't want to have to come back to the board each week for a new allocation. It's also of note that on the and related, a contractor, specifically Fire Ready, who was providing the hand crew services. As we approached the runway, we went slightly over the $500,000 they were authorized under the contract by $13,908. And there'll be a consent agenda item to modify that contract because it exceeds my contracting authority at $100,000 that we'll place on the next board meeting. I'd be happy to answer any questions from the board, but we believe this will set the district up in good position to continue rapidly executing the fuel break with appropriate biological monitoring.
I have a question. So we, the contractors that you've recommended, we approve. How does it work when when something needs to be done? Do you go down the list? I'm just curious because I see that, I do see that 2 of them are based in our district.
Yes, sir. So there's really 2 factors that go into it. One, do they have the equipment or the resources required for the job? If it's if they have tree fallers and a chipper and we're working in a grass and brush component, that's not the right tool for the job. If they have a hand crew and we need to drop trees, et cetera, et cetera. So first is identifying what's the need. The second is we make an effort to spread the contracting around as for a number of reasons, as well as which we want to sustain the local economy of folks who are capable of doing this. And then the third factor is availability and potential for travel time. Some of these contractors were included because they were the lowest price, but they are not local. And that means they are probably less interested in short duration work, as in there's a specialized resource that we need for a day or two, and the district is not in the position of paying for their travel time. And so it wouldn't make sense economically for a contractor to travel a long distance for a short period of work. You may recall in the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, the Fire Ready or the Firestorm folks that were doing the hand crew, they came down from Chico, but they were here for 3 months. And so economically, it made sense for them to set up a base of operations here and work. So from this perspective, we selected based on price. Well, first we screened for, did they have the basic qualifications identified in the RFP? Then we screened for price, and then we screened for proximity to the district. And lastly, we looked at what specialized resources they had specific to hand crews, which are few and far between.
I noticed several of them had also provided the chipper.
Yes, sir.
So they're not, I thought we were using ours when we could.
Yes, sir. We're primarily using ours. There are times when there are either competing demands, a neighborhood operation, or we've been making good use of providing to the city of Orinda where it can augment theirs so we can maintain the steady flow of chipping inside the community. So if ours is not available, then we would use a contracted chipper, but the primary is to put ours in service.
Because the rate per hour included a chipper.
Yes.
So that would be modified if they didn't need.
Yes, sir. Or if they didn't provide, if they were unable to provide the people without the chipper, then we would use a different contractor who is able to provide just manpower to staff our chipper. But the goal is that our chipper is running every day. There's a stack of replacement parts in Jeff's office because we've been wearing through teeth and belts and things because the chipper has been getting a lot of use.
Good.
Yes, sir. We're trying to run the hours up.
Okay.
Chief, I know that you're recommending to use Sequoia Environmental. Could you just provide the name of the other company? You said two.
Dudek, sir. Dudek.
Dudek.
Okay. No further question. We'll open for public comment.
So we have one hand raised, Sue Wedge.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to applaud the efforts of our fire department to increase the safety of our community with the 100 fuel break enforcement. I was reading, as what we all probably have, about the Maui wildfires, and a couple of the contributing factors were unmitigated wildgrass and weak code enforcement. So I just urge our fire department to continue their good work in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may just briefly, Sue, thank you for the comments. I would point out that the fuel break work we are continuing, which essentially runs a moat around the entire district, is only beneficial at slowing the ground component of fire. And it is hand in glove with the compartmentalization of interior parcels through the residential fuel break requirement and the creation of defensible space that creates the layered defense we will need to survive contact with the fire. The goal is to create a fire resilient community so that when the inevitable fire occurs, it burns around our community with the ground component, which the fuel break will support. And we do not have the exposure to wind-driven embers finding receptive fuel beds in the community. And when they do, that those fuel beds are limited in their horizontal and vertical continuity, so the fire spread is limited. So this is part and parcel of a comprehensive approach to wildfire risk reduction.
Any other public comments?
So we do not have any more public comment.
I'll make a motion.
Sure.
I'll make a motion to authorize the fire chief to enter into the agreement for wildland fuel management, tree removal, hazard abatement services, and authorize fire chief to enter into an agreement for environmental compliance services for wildland fuel management.
I'll second that.
Okay, moved and seconded.
And we'll open
call.
public comment on the motion.
Any public comment on it?
We do not have any public comment on the motion. Director Danziger.
Aye.
Director Hassler.
Aye.
Director Romer.
Aye.
President Jex.
Yes.
That concludes our
Meeting.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
Second.
Too late.
All those in favor,
Aye.
Aye.
the time is.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
The record.
Yeah.